The following video contains content that may be disturbing to some viewers. Topics include graphic discussions of crime, violence, and sensitive subject matter. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Welcome to Crime Desk. I'm your host, Troy Stiles. Today we're going to discuss a topic we hear about every day in the news, but the way it's often described doesn't give the subject full context of the fear and control that surrounds it. The topic is strangulation. Viewer discretion is advised. Did you know 1 in 4 women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime? And a woman who has suffered a non-fatal strangulation incident with her intimate partner is 800% times more likely to be killed by homicide. Brian Bennett is joining us today to talk about SC House Bill 3522, just introduced to legislators. South Carolina would be the 50th state in the nation to adopt non-fatal strangulation law, and it would consider the dangers of strangulation the first time. We're going to break down the dangers of strangulation, how H-3522 can make a difference for domestic violence victims across our state, and where you can go for the latest information and resources to learn more. Some of the details you are about to hear are for mature audiences only. Viewer discretion is advised. Brian, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this important topic.
Yeah, happy to join you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, so we're going to go through your resume and some of your experience. Your face does not match your experience, but it is quite a long resume. So we know that you are a retired state police academy instructor with over 25 years of experience, including as a police officer with 2 municipal police departments, attaining the rank of corporal and moving and working for a federal law enforcement agency, as well as serving as an instructor for the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy beginning in 2007. You instructed on average 1,000 hours of law enforcement training per year to basic training cadets and advanced officer training to roughly 16,000 officers statewide. That's incredible. You've researched, developed, and wrote the training curriculums for your areas of expertise at the Academy, and you regularly provide testimony and information on domestic violence related issues to the South Carolina State House Legislature and General Assembly. You also served on the Governor's Domestic Violence Task Force as the co-chairman of the Law Enforcement Subcommittee, and you work cooperatively with the South Carolina Attorney General's Office on domestic violence related programs and training. You've received numerous recognitions and recommendations for your police service solving major crimes, good conduct, and educational achievements, among many others. Wow, what a background.
No, thank you. I've been fortunate to have a lot of opportunities come my way, and I take them every time I got a chance.
Well, I know that you have been really working towards achieving a law in South Carolina on strangulation. It's something that and maybe since I've known you, I see it so many times a day, and maybe I didn't notice it as much before, but it seems like it is really becoming more prevalent in the news. Do you feel the same way, or are we just seeing these because we know about it?
I think the level of awareness and understanding is at a level that it's never been previously. Going back to my experience, it wasn't until roughly 2015, which is fairly long into my career, that I gained an added level of understanding about the dangers of non-fatal strangulation. I mean, obviously, if a strangulation act is completed, we have a homicide or a fatality. But there was an aspect of, at that time, domestic violence, a focus on domestic violence and strangulation, where 15 or 20 years of research led law enforcement and prosecutors to a different level of understanding as when I started early in my career. And so I started my career in the mid 1990s. And what we were told back then was basically, if you saw petechial hemorrhages in someone's eyes, those little ruptured capillaries, and you saw marks on the neck, those would be fairly substantial and affirmative signs that someone had been strangled. Unfortunately, that was not good research. It was very anecdotal, and it really made a lot of assumptions. not based on good science and good research. But again, around that 2015 mark, for me, I took a 4-day advanced level course on non-fatal strangulation, which was taught by some of the premier forensic pathologists and premier medical doctors in the United States that also had international recognition. And it was also co-taught by a number of prosecutors and law enforcement officers from California that had spent many years in this arena. And I realized very, very quickly that the information that I obtained early on in my career left me very short sighted. And what I came to realize is that there were many, many cases of strangulation, not just domestic violence, but in other types of assaults that I dealt with that occurred, but I did not know what to look for. And when I did see stuff, I didn't recognize what I was seeing. And personally, for me, it was a kick in the gut because I could remember cases that were likely strangulation related, and I didn't get it. And I thought to myself, how much longer did these victims suffer? And did any of them meet the end of their life? Because I didn't recognize what I needed. And so I made it a goal for myself at that point to not only just continue in the advanced level trainings and understandings of non-fatal strangulation, not just from a law enforcement perspective, but from a medical physiological perspective as well. But also because I was an instructor at State Police Academy, I had the power to create programs and expose all of South Carolina law enforcement officers to a understanding of strangulation that I never got. And so out of that just kept a progression of teaching not just law enforcement but prosecutors, victim advocates. I've taught coroners, medical examiners, nurses, doctors, victim advocates, and then just the public coming to some open training sessions. And without fail, what I generally find in those settings or after those presentations is there's this epiphany, there's this realization in those people, just like I had, that this is something they were not aware of. And I would say by the large majority, most people do not know how dangerous non-fatal strangulation is, not just to the targeted victim, but to many, many other collateral people around those situations.
Yeah, when I first heard about strangulation, I was actually, well, I mean, I've heard of strangulation, and I was working a case where strangulation was the charge, and ultimately resulting in homicide of a 20-year-old victim. But when I started deep diving into this, I was on a 5-hour drive, and I was in shock. When I landed to my destination, I just was in shock of what I had heard and trying to process what I had heard. I didn't realize the psychology from the victim, from law enforcement, and from the perpetrator, and how serious of a issue that this is, and its prevalence, but also some of the statistics. So I wanted to start by getting some definitions on the table here and kind of setting up our time together. Strangulation and choking are two different things, and they're not at all the same. Can you explain the difference in strangulation and choking?
Sure. So by and large, your general population out here will use the term choking to describe what is really a strangulation event. It's no fault of theirs. It's just the vernacular and it's the terminology that most people have heard in movies and on news broadcasts and in news reports. If somebody was choked, the reality is that choking is an accidental blocking of the internally of the airway. It's accidental and it's internal. And the problem with that is that mechanically and technically, choking is not the correct term to describe strangulation. Strangulation is a form of asphyxiation, and that form of asphyxiation is created by external pressure on areas of the neck and head that would occlude, which is a fancy word that means block, the carotid artery, the jugular vein, or the airway, the trachea. And that those blockages or that pressure or the duration of that pressure causes lack of oxygen to the brain. So that's what strangulation is. It's external pressure on structures of the neck that limit oxygen to the brain.
And
And
choking is a natural event. So choking on a piece of toast, choking on a piece of chicken,
right,
that's
and
different.
right, and that relates only to your trachea. That's not relating to your carotid artery that takes oxygenated blood to your brain and your jugular vein bringing deoxygenated blood. Strangulation is quite different. Now, there can be what we call accidental strangulations. That's where you hear like children and toddlers getting caught in like the cords of a blinds in the house, or somehow getting in a weird position in a crib or something like that. Obviously, with respect to criminal strangulation, we're talking about an intentional act to put a hands or a ligature around somebody's neck and applying a level of pressure that restricts this, oxygen that we need to survive and for our body and our brain to function in the right way. So I always emphasize when people are talking about strangulation or media or news relates to it, we have to use the correct terminology. And let's face it, choking, if you think about it, actually minimizes the terror and the damage and how serious somebody's experience is. Choking
Mhm.
uh, minimizes what that person actually went through. When, if you think about it, if you say, "Hey, pull someone on the street, hey, if do you think choking is more serious than strangulation?" Most people say, "Well, I think strangulation is a lot more serious because
Do you think
choking
that's
just
why
doesn't."
the media, do you think that's why the media refers to it as choking? Because that's a lighter word. It's been around for a long time. We're all used to hearing it. It doesn't sound as bad. Is strangulation a hard word for people to swallow?
I believe so, but I believe the choice of using choking versus strangulation is a detriment to people's understanding. Certainly, with program directors, they may say, well, if we use strangulation, that's too harsh of a word. It's too scary. Well, the fact of the matter is, what do you think the person who was being strangled was going through? That was the most terrifying experience of their life. Why do we need to minimize their experience if we want to put the reality of truth on it? In other instances, it's just misinformation. It's just people not knowing the technical differences. And then a third reason that choking is sometimes used is because that's the terminology that your strangulation victim uses. And so it might be a direct quote in an incident report. And it's okay to direct quote the victim using strangulation, but because we don't want to alter direct quotes of people in incident reports. But when law enforcement is speaking in that incident report, or a prosecutor or a medical examiner, then the terminology should be specified as strangulation. So there's a few different factors as to why choking is probably used.
Well, and it's interesting too when you realize that not all strangulation restricts the airway. It can be arterial as well. And we hear another term a lot, and it's asphyxiation.
Mhm.
And I see it here in your fact sheet as well. So does asphyxiation include strangulation, or does that fall under it? Because it is similar in some ways, but
Right.
it's not pressure, is it?
Right. It falls under a form of asphyxiation. I mean, asphyxiation, and I'm overgeneralizing and simplifying, is just the brain and the body being starved of the needed oxygen. So,
So they
if
both kind
you,
of do the same thing.
Mhm. Yeah, you still have some detrimental effects. I mean, if you were to, go up in an airplane to high altitude, depressurized, and the oxygen percentage drops, you're going to suffer a noxic and hypoxic, brain injury because of lack of oxygen. If you're, underwater and you ingest a lot of water, you're drowning is, essentially doing the same thing. It's just that strangulation is a specific form and function of the asphyxiation. What caused the asphyxiation? And this is that external pressure on those structures of the neck.
So some of the statistics in the world of in the topic of strangulation are really alarming and shocking, and I think that's what really grabbed my attention. A woman who has suffered a non-fatal strangulation incident with her intimate partner is 800% more likely to be killed by the same perpetrator with a gun.
Hmm.
One
Yeah,
in
that's
four women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, and on average, only 50% of strangulation victims have visible injuries. And it
mhm.
says that 35% of victims have injuries too minor to photograph, and only 15% of victims have visible injuries which can be photographed. So we can't always see when somebody's been strangled.
Correct. And that's one of the big misnomers or misinformation that was put out there years ago. Again, like I told you at the beginning, the petechial hemorrhages in the eyes and the marks on the neck were like considered like the gold standard, if you will. But what we have come to understand is it takes very, very little pressure to actually render someone unconscious. And because it takes such little pressure, the likelihood of seeing external injuries with our naked eye can be quite diminished. So, like you said, 50% of strangulation victims, and when I say this, I'm talking about fatalities and non-fatal strangulation. Roughly 50% of them will have no external injuries visible on their body. And what that means is if we're just using our visual acuity uh, as it relates to, having some type of credibility of someone being strangled, we're missing half the cases just because of, you know, what we're not seeing. And that's scary. And then when you realize that if we don't see these things, these people don't likely get to the hospital. And if we do see things, that they're so minor in scale and in their dimensional colors and sizes that we can't even document them correctly. So what that means is we have to rely on other signs and symptoms to help substantiate the credibility of a strangulation incident because those pressures are so minor.
Well, you talked earlier about the educational part of this and how much education, you've provided to
Mhm.
judges and officers and training and other advocacy networks. But the victim actually doesn't always know what has happened to them when this happens. Something about the hippocampus and the brain doesn't record once it gets to a certain point. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So one thing that when people evaluate, and when I say people, I'm talking about more than just law enforcement. We're talking about our prosecutors, our victim advocates, perhaps our medical professionals. When someone indicates that there might have been a strangulation, they do want to look for those visual signs, and those they may not be there, those external injuries. But we also really like to hear some type of story. Like, if someone was strangled, we would hope that they would be able to articulate in their words, exactly what happened and in a very linear way, something that's easy to understand. The fact of the matter is that someone who's been strangled uh, has a very fractured memory for many different reasons. Number one, just the trauma of the event, the trauma of a personal attack changes the way our body responds. And what I mean by that, and I'm getting a little deep here in the psyche and the psychology of the brain, but we have a very uh, primitive part of our brain. They call it the reptilian brain. That is a very primitive in nature. It's our brain's survival center, if you will. Every animal has a part of their brain that has a built-in survival instinct. And in the human brain, when someone experiences trauma, that reptilian natural survival instinct of our brain can respond in many different ways. It might be that fight, flight, or freeze, but it goes into a basic core function. It doesn't. Our brain doesn't operate in very high levels of operation. It's very simple and core levels of survival. Well, as a result of that, when the brain is being affected by this lack of oxygen and you add this trauma, it causes our brain to categorize memories in a very fractured way. So just from trauma alone, I tell officers and anyone interviewing a victim, don't expect them to tell you a linear story where all the pieces line up. Um, some parts of that memory may be completely excluded from their immediate memory and repressed as a survival instinct to the trauma itself. But then, to your point about strangulation, the part of the brain that is first affected by lack of oxygen is something called our hippocampus. It lies deep in our brain, and it's also part of our brain that stores memory. Well, when that hippocampus goes into a dysfunction because of lack of oxygen, it can't file memories correctly, And if you're completely unconscious, you can't file a memory at all because you don't have one. So it is
Wow.
not uncommon for some strangulation victims to what we call have indications of loss of consciousness. This is what I mean. They may say something like, "Well, I remember that this person was coming after me or coming towards me or put their hands on me in this spot, let's say in the kitchen, but I woke up outside in the ditch. I have no idea how I got there." Or I remember like backing up, and the next thing I remember was being face down on the floor, and they don't remember what happened in between.
Does
Um,
this make victims uncredible?
well, to some it does. With the right training, I tell people sometimes lack of something indicates something rather than disproves it. So when it comes to a strangulation assault, if I see a really fractured memory, I indicate very strongly that this might have something to do with their brain being affected by lack of oxygen, their lack of recall, their lack of a linear story and being very fractured can indicate that their brain was in a dysfunction state at the time that they were assaulted in this way.
Well, I know that you're working towards a strangulation bill in South Carolina for non-lethal or non-fatal strangulation. Um, 49 other states have this, and South Carolina does not. When did you first start talking to our General Assembly and our legislators about this bill?
So, as I said earlier, it was about 2015 when I got my advanced level of training, which has continued throughout my career. It still continues to today. Um, and so I decided around 2016 to start exploring what, if anything, had already been done within the laws that I may have been unaware of, even though I tried to be as well versed as possible. Maybe I missed something. And what I found is we didn't address it at all, really. And so myself and a couple other individuals, one law enforcement officer and one victim advocate, whom herself had been strangled as a teenager, we got together and we said, you know what, we need to start formulating some type of working group or some grassroots movement for South Carolina to address this problem. Now, fortunately, it was roughly about 2016 that South Carolina decided they needed a change in their domestic violence laws, that we were kind of way behind. And so they created the House Domestic Violence Reform Committee. And I had the opportunity in those committee hearings to make some suggestions to make our domestic violence laws stronger, one of which included the addition of some recognition of strangulation. And I promoted that as a felony level assault. I mean, strangling someone is about as close to attempted murder as you can get. And in some states, they do consider it attempted murder. So I worked within that committee, and they did make some slight changes to our domestic violence law, but unfortunately, when things went through that process, they put some language in there that was kind of really obscure and not very clear, left some room for interpretation, and also made it a misdemeanor in some regard. So you could strangle your household member or your intimate partner, as they call it in some states, and you could be charged with a misdemeanor, not a felony. So I was like, that is not what we were hoping for. But then through other levels of advanced training that I took, I came to find out that this emphasis on domestic violence and strangulation has actually grown much broader. And what I mean by that is strangulation is now a very prominent and consistent factor in sexual assaults, kidnappings, human trafficking, assaults against children, assaults against vulnerable adults and elders. So it's much, much broader. And that's what put us on this path now and for the last, well, since 2017, 2018, of having a standalone felony strangulation law that would protect all people that were assaulted in that way.
And 49 other states have that same type of law, correct?
Yes, South Carolina and Ohio were the last two states as of 2023. Ohio passed their legislation in 2023. And here we are in the beginning of 2025, and we have introduced the fourth bill in the South Carolina legislature for this next legislative session, and we're hoping that this will finally be the time that this is recognized, specifically defined, and we have a standalone non-fatal strangulation law specific to South Carolina.
So, one thing that I did want to ask about what you were just mentioning as far as it being a misdemeanor in South Carolina, is it considered a violent crime right now in South Carolina?
Uh, yes and no. If it's a misdemeanor level charge under the current domestic violence law, no. If felony level domestic charges like domestic violence of a high and aggravated nature, that is listed in our Title 16 as a violent crime. So there can be some enhancements um, when it's charged on the felony level, but therein lies again the problem. We have a lot of inconsistency in the charges that we see in South Carolina. We have strangulation incidents where, for whatever reason, no one's charged. Then we have people that are charged under not domestic violence, but some type of misdemeanor assault. We have some that go to high level aggravated assault and everything in between. And so we don't see very much consistency. And that's what another thing we're trying to rectify.
Do we currently track violent offenders who commit violent crimes in South Carolina if they're charged as a violent crime?
Generally, yes. Again, there's some coding and some records within the judiciary that make it relatively easy to track. But again, here's another problem: is we can't track strangulation well, and the reason we can't is because our systems here in South Carolina. What I mean by our systems, I mean our databases with respect to different professions: the hospital system, the judiciary, the prosecutors, the law enforcement. They don't use the same type of software. They use different coding in different languages, and specifically, we don't have a specific state statute to charge strangulation. So it makes it extraordinarily hard to find a pattern in South Carolina because we don't have the mechanism and the logistics set up to do that. And so numbers from South Carolina can be very, very hard to glean as compared to other states.
So introducing this bill, since it's fresh and this is a new session, this bill won't expire for 2 years. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
So what all is encompassed in this? I mean, obviously education is going to be really important, from just, road deputies to who are taking calls, all the way to judges who are handing down sentencing and prosecutors who are prosecuting these cases. So education, I would assume, would be a big piece of this. And then having the statute itself, and then educating deputies and officers on how to charge those statutes and when it's appropriate. So can you just go through what all is kind of wrapped up into this bill and what it's going to accomplish for South Carolinians?
Sure. Well, the first thing is that we want to save people's lives. And so strangulation, when you look at national research and data, strangulation is the number one indicator of a future homicide. Now, when people hear that, what they generally think of is the targeted strangulation victim, the homicide of them. And certainly within the realm of domestic violence research, as you said earlier, there's that 800% increase of being killed later with a firearm. But what I need people to understand is when I say strangulation is the number one indicator of a future homicide, we're talking about homicides of our law enforcement officers. We're talking about homicides of what I call collateral victims that are around domestic violence situations. We're talking about homicides, and again, involving these human trafficking victims, children, vulnerable adults. And there's data out there that has indicated that quite a few of our mass shooters and mass shooting incidents in the United States were committed by individuals who had patterns and histories of strangling their intimate partners. So this statute hopefully would bring attention to a pattern of strangulation that we can intervene at that time and hopefully prevent any level of homicide against any person. So that's number one, save lives. Number two, we definitely want a standalone statute so as not to have these situations mixed in and muddled in with a lot of other statutes. We want something to stand alone so we can track it by statutory number. I think it's important that if there's a bill and ultimately a law, we need to have the ability to see its successes or failures and to make adjustments where we need to. And the only way to do that is to track. We also, the other benefit is that we specifically define what strangulation is so that everybody speaks with a common language and a common understanding of what qualifies a strangulation. And then another benefit is, like you said, training education. At least while I was at the State Police Academy, I was able to put strangulation training in the basic training curriculum that every law enforcement officer got some exposure to non-fatal strangulation. But in South Carolina, that is the only profession that has a standardized training in non-fatal strangulation signs and symptoms and what you're supposed to do in making charges. Our medical field doesn't get that. Our paramedics, our EMTs, are just our regular nurses, our judges, our prosecutors. They don't get any standardized training as part of a basic curriculum or as a recertification
Well, and
type of
also
standard.
with the training that you do, it's still kind of optional and whether or not they use that in their departments. So would this statute help align some of that and make it, since it would be a statute?
I believe so. I believe a statute would necessitate different entities and professions to develop some in-house non-fatal strangulation training to be in compliance with their role in dealing with a person who has been strangled. I mean, let's face it, not everyone who is assaulted reports to law enforcement. Sometimes they go to their urgent care. Sometimes they go to the emergency room. Sometimes they talk to a trusted friend. Sometimes they talk to their hairdresser. I've actually done non-fatal strangulation classes for cosmetology schools because people talk to their hairdressers and their cosmetologists sometimes more. And so I believe that a statute would bring these professions and these entities up to a base standard as a matter of necessity. You know,
Well, the girl that
yeah, go
cuts
ahead.
my hair definitely knows all my secrets. So I think that's a great place to do training. Um, with forensics and expert, like forensic interviews and forensic exams, this really stretches far beyond law enforcement into hospitals and emergency rooms. And can we talk about some of the education that this bill may bring forth in those realms?
Sure. Some people may have heard this terminology that I'm using, but it's called sane sexual assault nurse examiner or an FNE, which is a forensic nurse examiner. They're essentially the same thing. Those nurses are registered RNs. They have a 4-year degree, but they've gone through specialized training to not just medically attend to a sexual assault or strangulation or domestic violence victim, but they are also very key to the collection of forensic evidence. There's a protocol, an exam protocol that is very, very invasive that they are intimately familiar with. And so we always advise that if someone's been strangled or indicate strangulation, that they get to a hospital and specifically seek out one of those forensic nurses because your emergency room doctors and your regular nurses that do the triage work and some of the emergency work, they don't have this specialized training in many cases. So people come in and there's indications of the strangulation, but they don't do the appropriate exams. They don't offer the appropriate follow up. And as a result, some of these victims are sent home to suffer more. And these, we haven't really mentioned it, but I can mention it now. Without immediate medical triage, someone who's been strangled can actually die months later from the internal injuries that they've suffered that you would never see with your naked eye. That's why that medical exam and those the appropriate medical exams need to be done because many times these victims are going to suffer injuries that they will have complications with their entire life or may actually lose their life in a matter of hours, weeks, or months later. And so again, I think the strangulation statute would broaden, if you would, more than just the forensic nurses having an understanding, but all the medical personnel in the emergency room. I think you would. I think if you talk to any hospital in the country, they would tell you that there's always a shortage of forensic nurse examiners. There is a desperate need. They're not in every hospital. Sometimes they have to be called from 3 or 4 counties away in the middle of the night because there's just not that many of them. And the more people we have in the emergency room that are informed, know how to triage, stabilize, and aftercare, the better the outcome is going to be for many of our strangulation victims. I mean, the number one goal is to save their life. We can always get the bad guys later through warrants and criminal investigations. We got to save the life of our people that have been injured.
So I always thought of strangulation as just putting your hands around somebody's throat and squeezing. And then when I did learn that it could be done just by applying pressure to that carotid artery, there's something called a carotid dissection.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like where the artery gets separated, or what happens in that?
Yeah, so a carotid dissection, most people who've gone through a science class in middle school have heard the term dissection. And that simply just means to separate. It's just a fancy word that means separation. But a carotid dissection is a complication that can happen from a strangulation assault. And essentially what happens is with sometimes pressure alone or just the torsion of the violence of the strangulation, the internal wall of the carotid artery can tear. And so I use my hands as an example. Let's imagine this is the internal wall of the carotid artery, and this is the artery that takes oxygenated blood from your heart and lungs up into your brain through both the left and right side of your neck. Well, that internal wall can tear, so you're not hemorrhaging out into the muscle and under the skin where you would see it. Really, the only hemorrhaging is where the internal wall has torn. And what happens is that as blood is flowing through the carotid artery, this little flap of tissue is making this kind of motion, and it creates a little eddy or a pool. Well, the body's natural response to any damage is to start clotting the blood. So not only do you have, the wall, the arterial wall starting to form a clot to heal that area, but you also have this pool of blood that's creating a little eddy that creates a collection of blood as well. And those clotting factors create a blood clot. And this carotid artery dissection is not something that a victim would feel. And this is not something that we would see with our naked eye. This is something that has to be done in a very specific medical exam through an MRI or something called a CTA. That's a CT scan with an angiogram. They use a imaging dye to look at the structures. And if you don't pick up on that, hopefully the person will live. Hopefully that blood clot will dissolve itself and there'll be no immediate complications. But if that blood clot or fragments of that blood clot break loose, it can cause a stroke. And this is where we've had cases where, some seemingly perfectly well individual has died from a stroke, and they call it a cryptogenic stroke when it's a stroke of unknown origin. They're like, well, we don't know what caused this stroke. They had no, comorbidity issues. They didn't have any blood. And some of those have been traced back to a unreported strangulation.
So right now, if you get into a fight with your spouse and the police come out, you don't have to press charges. Police can automatically press charges. The state of South Carolina, it'll be state of South Carolina versus whoever, and the state will assume those charges. Is because this is sometimes charged as a misdemeanor, then that doesn't currently apply. Is that correct?
Yeah, so when you're looking at misdemeanor level charges, generally, when you're looking at a misdemeanor level charge, you're looking at an on-scene officer who is going to take the burden of prosecuting that case. Here in South Carolina, even in domestic violence cases, there is no automatic assignment of a trained attorney prosecutor prosecuting a domestic violence case. We think that's a problem here in South Carolina. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a law enforcement officer who may not have a law degree to go up against a trained defense attorney. That's something we've tried to rectify over the years, but it hasn't happened that way. So with misdemeanor cases, you're sometimes rolling the dice as to what level of prosecution, what level of understanding the state can bring against the defendant in order to substantiate that misdemeanor charge. When it's a felony level charge, We know then at that point it goes to general sessions, and there will be a solicitor or a deputy solicitor, as we call it in South Carolina. Some states call it a DA, who will prosecute. They're a trained attorney. But even with that said, many of them don't know how to prosecute a strangulation case very well because they haven't had the training, they haven't had the experience. And so we don't always see consistency in convictions either with these charges, even with a trained prosecutor.
So essentially, if somebody calls 911 or the police end up on scene and she does not or he does not want to prosecute or doesn't understand what's happened to them, they think, oh, it's okay, he didn't mean it, or they don't realize they've lost consciousness. Currently, that may not be charged, especially if it's just a misdemeanor. But once it becomes a felony law, then that will basically, in some situations, remove the victim from the pressure of having to charge that, right? And then once officers are educated on how to field screen these victims, they'll understand more about how to charge it and why they should charge it as strangulation in these cases. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's to the benefit of our targeted victims, to the benefit of our law enforcement officers to have a standalone felony strangulation law. And again, being taught what to look for, how to document it, how to get the proper medical care, which the medical care is medical care / collect forensic evidence to make these cases stronger and easier to prosecute. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that assessment.
So then once we get the felony charges and, then that leads them to the healthcare and the forensic assessment. And then that builds the case for prosecution. And then you're going to be out there making sure our prosecutors and solicitors are educated in this topic. So we should have a good result. But it all really depends on the strangulation law in South Carolina, or
Yeah, I mean,
non-lethal strangulation law in South Carolina.
yeah, I believe so. I believe that is very, very critical to our success in saving people's lives is, again, having everyone speaking a common language with common understood uh, documented terms, and everyone doing their part. I always tell in my trainings, because many times I do what I call multidisciplinary type of trainings, where we have victim advocates, nurses, medical professionals, the whole gamut of people in there. And I tell my audience that if any one of us in this chain of care and accountability around these strangulation incidents, if any one of us as an entity or individual does not do our job, it weakens the whole thing. I mean, if I as a law enforcement officer don't document well, I don't give the prosecutor very, very much to utilize in prosecuting the case. If we don't get them to the hospital like we should, or if the right exams aren't done, again, we're hamstringing not just the case, but we're hamstringing patient care. If our judges don't understand, aspects of it, I mean, so we're really, harming our victims if any of these entities do not operate with the highest level in their specialty when addressing these type of situations. It really all it takes is one drop in the ball, and the whole thing can crumble.
So we know that the National Domestic Violence Hotline is certainly a place where victims can go. That phone number is 1-800-799-733. Strangulation traininginstitute.com has a lot of resources when it comes to strangulation. And then the Family Justice Center, that's familyjusticecenter.org. They also have a lot of resources on strangulation. Can we talk about some of the symptoms that a victim may experience, not knowing that they've possibly been strangled, or even know that they've been strangled and now they may not know that they've lost consciousness? We talked about some of the seriousness of losing consciousness, probably not as much as we should have, but
Right.
I want to talk about that a little bit more. But what are some of the symptoms that somebody may recognize after strangulation that may indicate that they've actually lost consciousness?
Yeah. So let me add the loss of consciousness, but also instances where there isn't loss of consciousness, but a strangulation still occurred. Because
For sure.
even without loss of consciousness, there is a risk of death. there is at least 25 known medical complications with being strangled, many of which could be potentially fatal. I'll start with just the external ones. And so some of what we already talked about was the petechial hemorrhages, the burst capillaries in the eyes, and the marks on the neck. Now, the marks on the neck, let's talk about that quickly for a moment. Marks on the neck can be caused by many different things. It could be caused by the hands or the offenders, another part of their body. When people think of being strangled, sometimes they think of one hand or two hand, but many people have been strangled with a forearm or inside a head, like a headlock type of hold. Sometimes people are very well versed in mixed martial arts holds, and there's different neck holds that use the forearm and the bicep and the chest to create that same type of hold. People have been strangled being caught in a scissor lock between someone's legs, standing up, laying down, strangled from the front, from the side, from behind. And so the marks on the neck can come from the perpetrator due to the level of pressure and the duration of that pressure. Some of it could come from the ligature, if a ligature is used. So some of the ligatures that I've seen in cases as a USB power cord, the coax cord on the cable box, pantyhose, bras, t-shirts, sweatpants. So some abrasions can happen due to that pressure being applied by the offender. But think about this. I would just ask people to think about this for themselves. If somebody were strangling you and you could not get that person's hands or ligature from your neck, what would you do? And many people would, try to pull at it. Well, some of the marks that we see is from the victim themselves digging into their own neck to get behind that area of constriction. I've seen cases where there is no bruising per se from a hand or abrasions from a ligature. It's claw marks of the victim themselves. So those petechial hemorrhages that are in the eyes, that's not the only place that they can occur. I won't get too technical right now, but a certain mechanism of strangulation has to occur for petechial hemorrhages to happen. It's not an absolute on every strangulation. It depends on where the pressure was and what structure was affected in the neck. So sometimes it may be in the eyes, but we have found petechial hemorrhages in the gums, on the roof of the mouth, the soft palate, the back of the throat, inside the ears, around the ears. We have seen it on the scalp, like not on the face, but in the hairline here. For light-complected people, from a distance, it may look like they have a sunburn, but when you get really, really close, you see that sunburn that was kind of all morphed together, that sunburnt look, once you get close, kind of separates into these very small dots of petechiae. So really, these petechiae can occur in many different areas above the point of constriction.
We're talking about pressure a lot. I read
Yeah.
somewhere, I think, that it takes 7 pounds of pressure to strangle someone, or PSI, but 22 PSI to open a Pepsi. Is that true?
Yeah. So when we're talking about how sometimes we don't see these external injuries, so comparatively, it takes about 5 pounds of pressure for roughly 5 to 10 seconds on your carotid artery to close it enough to render you unconscious. So the trigger pull on most police officer duty pistols, the trigger pull of pounds of pressure per square inch on a law enforcement firearm is about 5 pounds. So that's nothing to close off your carotid artery. It takes roughly about 11 pounds of pressure to close off your jugular vein, and it takes about 30 to 33 pounds of pressure to close off your trachea. So the opening a can of Pepsi or a can of Coke, to be fair to both parties, it takes about 20 pounds of pressure per square inch to pull the tab on a metal canned soda. It takes.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's such a small amount for such a short duration to render someone unconscious. Another comparison is studies they've done on the average strength of a handshake. The average strength of an adult handshake is 40 to 60 pounds of pressure per square inch. And people say, well, it doesn't feel like 40 or 60 pounds. Well, that's because those pounds of pressure are spread out over a larger surface area. That's why
Well,
some.
how long would you need to apply that pressure and have someone unconscious and keep applying that pressure to then actually take someone's life?
So if the carotid artery is occluded, it takes about 5 seconds, 5 to 10 seconds. The jugular vein, it takes about 5 to 10 seconds. If it's just the trachea, it takes a good bit longer. And the reason for that is, and if you think about it, if you think back to your anatomy, if your carotid artery and your jugular vein are open, like as they should, you have a certain amount of dissolved oxygen in your bloodstream. And if those are not occluded, your airway may be closed off, but your brain is still getting some level of oxygen, but it's going to use up that oxygen through the blood all throughout your body. And how long before you go unconscious with your trachea being occluded varies from person to person. It really does. I mean, if you were to take someone who, I don't know, was a free diver and could, dive to 200 feet below the ocean on one breath of air, well, their body has learned to acclimate to operating with low levels of oxygen, and they would be able to last a lot longer with just their trachea being closed. This is why, relating back to the Eric Garner case, that's the case out of New York where this gentleman named Eric Garner was selling cigarettes on the streets of New York, and a NYPD task force doing street level crime suppression and people selling bootleg cigarettes and everything encountered him. And when they went to place him under arrest, there was some level of resistance and a struggle ensued. Well, the point I'm trying to bring out is in that video, one of the officers had his arm around Eric Garner's neck. And he kept saying, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." Well, when you understand strangulation, he um, can breathe because he was able to speak and articulate words. In other words, there was air traveling across his larynx and going into his lungs and out of his lungs. People say, well, why does he say he can't breathe? Well, because in that case, his carotid arteries and his jugular veins were being shut off. And that limits oxygen to the brain much, much quicker. So in his brain detected a drop in oxygen, and no matter how much he was breathing, that oxygenated blood was not getting to his brain. And so that's why he was saying, "I can't breathe." He could, it's just that the oxygenated blood was not getting there. So when someone is being strangled with these different amounts of pressure, it could be one of those structures by themselves or a combination of those structures collectively that could, render someone unconscious very, very quickly. Now, as far as when someone would die, data and research told us at one time it was around 4 minutes without oxygen before you had brain death. That has now been adjusted over the last few years to roughly anywhere between a minute and 2 minutes.
And
So,
damage can occur way before that, right?
yeah, correct. And so it's really interesting when I talk to people. Anytime that your brain is unconscious due to lack of oxygen for in whatever means or method created that situation where there's no oxygen, whether it's strangulation or a drowning or again high altitude with no oxygen, there is brain cell death. There's just no way around it. When the brain does not have the needed oxygen and it goes into an unconscious state, brain cells are dying by the hundreds of thousands. And what's really interesting for people to think about is people can be strangled and survive what we call non-fatal strangulation. But if these instances happen over and over, you get a progression in brain cell death, which could actually lead to different short-term and long-term uh, diminished mental capacities. So people will suffer long-term and short-term exposures to stress, but the physiology of their brain and their psyche starts to change, and they can actually start to experience different anxiety disorders, psychosis, and all kinds of brain dysfunction because their brain just simply doesn't work anymore. There's sections of it that have died, and they're not aware of it.
Well, we also know that strangulation is not always a violent act. Some people choose this as a sexual foreplay. We also hear of auto asphyxiation, which often in times involves ligature. And then there's, if they become unconscious, there's nobody there to
Mm-hmm.
unhinge them. So sometimes that ends up just being ruled a suicide. But sometimes it's actually for sexual gratification. So you're saying that each time that somebody goes through this act, that they're losing more and more, and their brain is actually becoming more and more damaged. So what about when people? I always wonder about this law and this statute coming out, and then when people agree to it, what is too far? And when does the perpetrator, sometimes maybe not a perpetrator, maybe somebody that's madly in love with you, but we know sometimes this is a passion crime as well. So when is it too much? Is there a certain limit of strangulation that's okay, or is it all fatally dangerous?
Yeah, it's all potentially dangerous. It just is dependent on whether a person's particular state has established when too much is too much. There are some states, and I don't know specifically which states, but there are some states that have criminalized strangulation in intimate practices of people's sexual behavior, because the experts that exist in those states have said there is no safe way to strangle somebody. There isn't. There is no safe way. There's always a potential for a death to occur or someone to suffer serious bodily injury. But what we know, and actually there's been quite a significant amount of emphasis on this the last few years, is the normalization of strangulation within the porn industry and within people's intimate practices within the bedroom. And to what you were talking about, um, let's take a scenario, if you will, for South Carolina. Again, we don't have anything on the books right now, but if there was some consensual or mutual strangulation that occurred, I would say first, law enforcement's not going to hear about it unless someone had a problem with it, which is kind of scary. Um, Again, there was a study that a researcher did not too long ago where they surveyed a little over 4,000 college students, and 82% of those college students said that they had participated in a strangulation, consensual strangulation during their intimate uh, times with a partner. 82% out of 4,200 college students. So that tells you kind of the normalcy of it. And some of them thought there was no danger associated with it. And they said, and people say, well, why are they doing this anyway? Well, there can be a euphoric feeling to some that comes out of being strangled. And the reason behind this is when the brain is starved of oxygen and then the pressure is released, it creates a euphoric high in a person's medical physiological being. And what that high comes from is two things. One, brain cells dying, but also the brain being flooded with oxygenated blood. And this is where some people have rationalized this consensual practice in that, well, I'm not using alcohol or drugs to enhance my sexual pleasure. This is something that is controllable. People can stop when they're told to stop, and I'll be fine. But the reality is, again, there's no safe way to be strangled. That risk of a fatality is always there. And that's looking at it from the person who is being strangled. But then we also have a perception from the person who is doing the strangling. And for some of those, there is a sexual gratification, not through a physiological heightened euphoria or climax, but a climax that is uh, perpetrated on a psychological factor of exerting power and authority over another. You looked at some of these serial killers that we've had over the years, and some of them have related to that. They've related to a sexual pleasure and a climax that resulted from injuring another person.
I'm
And so,
recording on this every single day, and Brian, it seems like the crowd that is mostly in the headlines are younger people. And I don't know that it's always sexual, but it feels like it's a drug, especially for the strangler. And I hear a lot of victims say that their strangler actually looked them in the eyes while they were strangling them, which, you know, screams passion. But the majority of the people that are in these stories that we're writing and reading are young, and they're just, it seems to be like a drug that you can't just call a drug dealer and get. And we see a lot of times they'll start out with like strangling a cat.
Mhm.
um you know, if any cat lovers watching, sorry, but that's a common trait of um where they lead up. And the story that I was talking about at the beginning, it was the Jessica Barnes case. She's 20 years old, and her accuser, it was alleged that he brought all of her cats into the bedroom and strangled them one by one in front of her, and then eventually he strangled her. But I think it feels like it's such a high that there's almost, it's almost easier to like start measuring the time in between when they strangle something. It's like once they do it, they
Mhm.
have to do it again.
Mhm. Yeah, and that seems to be again a common thread. Even outside the intimate intimate relations or intimate partner relationship, what we've seen is that people who strangle have a killer mindset. I mean, if you can, I
Do you
mean, the
think
best
it
way for
can
me to say this
ignite
is I
that
think,
though? Like it
say
feels
again, I'm
like
sorry.
it feels like it ignites that, and people that maybe don't have that mindset, once they do that, it's almost like a finish line. Like they're in a marathon and they have to get to the finish line, and that is the climax of it. So do you think people
Mm.
start off with that, or can that be awakened or turned on by strangling?
In my perspective, I think it can be awakened and turned on. I think everyone who has a halfway intact intellect knows that we have to have oxygen as a necessity of life. Anyone that says that they don't know that, well, then I don't think their intellect is too intact. So for, some people some people say they operate in ignorance. I didn't know this was dangerous. I didn't know this was dangerous. Well, you should have known it was dangerous, because if you went underwater and held your breath for a certain amount of time and you never came up, you would expire. If you held your breath for a certain amount of time, you would expire. So I think there's this innate knowledge of self-preservation in all people that oxygen is necessary for life. But I think they repress that, and for perhaps something that they've seen, something that they've heard, something that they've experienced themselves, leads them to that first exploration, if you will, of utilizing this and exploring for themselves. How much pressure did it take? How long did it take? What were the results of it? And I think to some degree there's a desensitizing that takes place where they can rationalize doing these things and not feel bad about doing it for their own selfish pleasures or ambitions. And it tends to, again, start a very direct downward progression of increase in frequency and increase in level of violence and pressure being applied. It's kind of like testing the water, so to speak, and then it keeps going a little bit further. And just when you talk about within an intimate setting of the bedroom, talk to any psychologist, and they will tell you that in some ways, some of these sexual practices are like a drug. There has to be a something that takes it to another level to get that same high, that same climax. And when that doesn't work, let me take it up a notch. Let me take it up a notch. Take it up a notch. And they're seeking this constant fulfillment, or this constant climax that doesn't ever seem to be fulfilled, which inherently pushes them into an area which may ultimately be, a homicide.
Well, and we speak to all the indicators like mass shootings. These are the calls that law enforcement officers get hurt on the most. You know, there's so many indicators with strangulation, and the really strangulation is the indicator of murder and
Mm-hmm.
loss of life. It's quite scary.
You, yeah, and you've done a lot of work in the area of missing persons cases, and good credit to you for doing that. One thing that I always say, and this is I think can be borne out in research in cases all over the country, anytime that I see a story of a missing woman who was in a relationship at the time, the first thing I think of is endangered. In the law enforcement realm, when someone ends up missing, um, different protocols kick in depending on the level of danger. In other words, if someone's missing but there's no indicators of them being in immediate danger, it's still put out as a missing person, but not with an endangered kind of title on there. Anytime I see a story of a woman missing who was in a relationship, she needs to be listed as missing endangered, because a large majority of the time, at least in our state, those women end up being found later dead. And quite frequently in 2024, many of our missing women in South Carolina were actually strangled to death.
Well, how would we know
And
that if it's just a misdemeanor aggravated charge?
right, right. And so, cyclical thing where we come around to this again, with where, if we recognize it early on, and in many of these cases, and of course, this, in many of these cases where we've had these homicides in South Carolina and in the nation, when we backtrack history, we find the strangling of pets, we found the strangling of former boyfriends and girlfriends or former associates, or, some prior pattern that leads us to this. What we say, non-fatal strangulation is the number one indicator of a future homicide, and it pops up over and over again. And like you say, I think you see it a lot more now that you've got an education, and I see it everywhere. Matter of fact, a case just here the other day, I told somebody there was an arrest that took place, and I told them, I said, I bet there's going to be some type of strangulation in this story. The full story wasn't released yet, and sure enough, not 2 days later, it popped up in there that was part of it, and it's almost like I expect it now, because
Brian,
it's so prevalent and
if
so
I
frequent.
tagged you in all the strangulation stories that I see every day, you would have me charged with harassment. It is
It's
insane. I mean, it's almost every other story, at
mm,
least 6 to 10 a day, and I'm not seeing a lot of them. And
yeah,
it's only a matter of time once somebody strangles before they do it again. It's
mm,
the ultimate, and when you talk to these victims, they'll tell you, like, that was the moment. Like, he could hit me, I knew what a hit felt like. He could spit on me, he could throw something heavy at me, I could catch it mid-flight. But when he strangled me, I gave everything I had to him,
yeah,
and I
and
didn't hold anything for myself.
the fact of the matter is when when you can be unconscious in anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds when the strangulation starts, you don't really have any time to defend yourself or even put up much of a fight. By the time you realize what's going on, you're unconscious in many regards. And like I said, when there's this lack of external injury that we see, and the person can't formulate a linear story, many people along the line tend to discredit them. And along those same lines, let me just mention real quick some of the signs and symptoms of internal injury, because
Hmm.
I think I neglected that earlier. Well, memory loss is one of them. Okay, not being able to account for time and place. We have trouble swallowing, which makes sense if this area has been traumatized in some way. We have trouble swallowing. Some of the victims have trouble breathing. Um, if you think about the like how your body responds to an injury, this is the common example that I use. You're playing a game, let's say baseball, basketball, football, and you sprain your ankle and it hurts and you fall down, and you're kind of rubbing your ankle, and the coach is like, let's get back in there, and you play the rest of the game on a sore ankle, but the next day you wake up, your ankle's the size of a grapefruit. It's called wound progression. It takes time for the body to respond to an injury. Well, sometimes that troubled breathing can happen very, very quickly, or it can happen over a matter of hours because that airway is starting to swell shut. So
I
trouble.
hear victims say 6 and 8 months later, they still have sore throat, trouble
Mhm.
swallowing, from like
Yeah,
scar tissue and things that build from these injuries.
yeah. So you have trouble breathing, trouble swallowing, and the trouble swallowing part comes from, it can come from the soft tissue trauma, but a lot of times it comes from the nerves being damaged that control the swallowing mechanism. And this is where some of your strangulation victims will tell you that maybe for days they couldn't drink anything because every time they drank something, because the nerves weren't functioning correctly, water kept going down their trachea instead of their esophagus. but that also relates to trouble speaking. About 50% of the time, a strangulation victim will have an altered voice. And again,
A
that could be
raspy voice.
it could be well, it could not necessarily raspy, but it could be changed in some way from what their normal is. Might be higher, might be lower, but there's some dysfunction of the larynx that again that could be due to soft tissue damage, but also could be from a nerve dysfunction from those nerves being damaged. You also have, in some cases, complaints of a headache, so soreness in the head, soreness in the neck. What's really interesting is also involuntary urinating and defecating on oneself. What we see in cases where the victim is strangled, and this is not an absolute, but when you are unconscious, it is not uncommon for victims to urinate on, and defecate on themselves involuntarily, because when the brain has gone unconscious, the autonomic functions of our body also go into a dysfunction. So where the muscles that control our bladder and our intestines and our rectum relax, and so what happens sometimes is your victims revive, and they've gone to the bathroom on themselves, and of course they're embarrassed by it. For a law enforcement officer and for a medical professional, that's really important to know because many times the victims will dispose of those clothes. So even if law enforcement does show up, those clothes are in the wash or they're in the garbage can, and that's an indication of a loss of consciousness. It also
And I'm
indicates,
sure they typically leave that out of their story.
who wants to tell a law enforcement officer they've gone to the bathroom on themselves? Now, in some cases, the victims have, and they don't even realize it yet when the officers get there, and the officers see it for themselves. But that also indicates that something really, really severe, like on the most severe level, was happening to their brain. They need triage even more so
Mhm.
because of uh, some complications. But and then another one too that I can touch on is called thyroid storm. So right here in your neck is your thyroid gland that surrounds your larynx. When that thyroid gland is compressed, it can release a massive dose of different type of hormones in the body. Your thyroid gland produces many type of hormones that control functions in your body. The thyroid storm is one where some of the hormones that can be released can actually kill you. Um, uh, there have been patients that have been brought into emergency rooms with the doctors that specialize in this who've had temperatures of 105, 106 degrees. They don't have a bacterial infection. They don't have a viral infection. Their body temperature has been raised because of the overdose of these hormones, certain hormones that are released into the body. These hormones can also cause heart attacks, different heart arrhythmias, compression of the vagus nerve. There's a nerve that runs down through the center of your body that controls a lot of the autonomic functions of the core of your body. That of the vagus nerve can also cause different heart arrhythmias and different GI problems. And so it's even more than I can express tonight, but there's so many problematic issues that are going on internally that, you know, without the trained individual, we miss, and the victims suffer unnecessarily, and their lives are in danger.
Wow, it's such a well, yeah, like you said, I mean, we cannot get it in all in one episode. And you and I have talked about doing a few different episodes and really going down the tube with a forensic nurse and some other parts of this that could speak to those exams and just all the different. I mean, it's multifaceted how it needs to be rolled out. It's not just, words on paper. It's a lot of education. It's some checklists. It's consistency. It's explanation, terminology. It really, it, sometimes when I look at all the time that you've spent doing this, it seems like a long time. But then once you get into the topic, you realize it would take that long to cover all the sectors that you've covered. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but it's necessary. I mean, it is a very intense topic, but it's also one that requires a massive amount of understanding to understand correctly. It's very it would be very hard to express to someone in 5 minutes what really needs to be known for any
It's
professional.
impossible. Yeah,
Even the public. I mean, I can't sit down on a bench and in 5 minutes package it up, and it's very heavy in the education. Like I said, heavy in the terminology, heavy in the understanding of not just the legalities but the medical physiological. That's why when I talk to these doctors and nurses, I can talk to them on that level, because that level of understanding is what is needed, not just to the medical professional, but the law enforcement officer. I would say this, though: if there's anyone out there who would like kind of what I call the down and dirty of non-fatal strangulation, there's two sources that I would point them to. The first one is a YouTube video called Nurse Joanne Explains Strangulation. This video was produced by the Institute on Strangulation Prevention out of California. And this nurse, she is actually a forensic nurse, and they filmed an interview with her as if she was talking to a patient in the emergency room. And so, whether it's because you want to get educated or you want to share this information, anybody watching that video would have a very good understanding of the need to get immediate medical attention. Another resource that I may offer is if you go into your search engine and you type in free online strangulation training, there is a link by the Institute on Strangulation Prevention, and it brings up a page. And when you see it, it says PAVNet. It's out of Pennsylvania. It says PAVNet. It's a black screen, and it's got a police officer standing on the right. And what you can do is you can take a free 25-minute interactive non-fatal strangulation course. It's completely free. It's interactive. You watch some videos, you got to click on some questions and some answers, and it kind of takes you through a little process. And in 25 minutes, you can have a really good basic understanding. And at the end of that little 25-minute training video, you can actually take a post test. It's like 10 questions out of a 100-question bank, and get a little certificate. Now, it doesn't make you an expert in strangulation, but it definitely, in a short period of time, packages it very, very well. I think with enough understanding that if you needed to inform somebody, you could probably sit down and have a really good conversation with your friend or someone else who really needed this help and this understanding.
those are two great resources. I'll be sure to link those in the bottom of this video. Also, you have a Facebook group, and I know you just recently made that group private. So can people find it publicly? They just need to join it and then answer the questions. How does that work?
Yeah, so the my group Facebook page is called Strangulation Law for SC. In other words, S is in Sam, C is in Charlie. So Strangulation Law for South Carolina, SC. It is a private Facebook page. It was open to the public, but to preserve people's anonymity to some degree, and understanding that some people on there may have aggressors who are trying to track them down or see what they're involved in. We've made it private, but you can ask to join that page. There's a series of questions that you'll need to answer as it relates to privacy, respecting people's rights, and being professional and courteous. And also, you can't be an entity. I do require that people identify themselves to some degree. We've had some entities go on there, but who's behind that entity, I don't know. I need to put a name with a face. We don't market on there for funds or anything like that. But what I put on that page isn't just for South Carolina, although I focus on South Carolina legislative efforts, and I've got research documents on there and papers that I've written and videos that I do. But I also put educational information in there that I've got people all over the world on there, from South Africa, the United Kingdom, Canada, who have found information on there helpful, just to share with their peers and get some resources. So it's
Yeah,
very diverse and
I learn something in that group every week. I pay pretty close attention to it. It's definitely in my feed. So
well, thank you
we
for
know the
that.
National Strangulation Institute is also a great resource, and the hotline. So people can get to the hotline by going to thehotline.org. That's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You can also call 1-800-799-7233. And then what can people do to help support this bill in South Carolina that are South Carolinians? What can they do?
Yeah. So whether someone's in South Carolina or not, I still would appreciate their assistance in bringing an emphasis to this to our legislative body, what we call our General Assembly, and that's simply our senators and our House representatives in South Carolina. On the strangulation law for SC page, we certainly have a lot of people on there represented out of South Carolina. And what I encourage them to do is go to our South Carolina legislative webpage and find the senator or representative for their area. Now, I'm going to make a generalized term and say that I would hope that all senators and all House members would listen to anyone in South Carolina, even if it's not in their jurisdictional area or their district. But I would say that you're probably going to be most heard by the person who directly represents you. So, to that end, I tell people to email their senator or House member, to make phone calls to their office, to ask them to support this bill and the idea to save lives in South Carolina. I mean, if we know something is so dangerous, why would we not do everything that we can to save people? And that's
I
what I want
agree.
our General Assembly to understand is we've gone way too long without it. We have a lot of emphasis on drunk driving laws and human trafficking and fentanyl and stuff like that we've addressed, but this is one area that was still desperately lacking. So, contacting their legislative members, and for those outside of South Carolina who can speak with a level of authority to maybe what their state has done, particularly people who have been active in the legislative efforts in their state and met with success, I would say add your voice to it as well. That would definitely be helpful. Another thing is just letting the media know. A great credit to you and Jen and Fitz News and a number of our print media in South Carolina, but overall, our I don't know what you call it, our visual media, if you would call it that, our network stations haven't really expressed any interest in covering this. I'm not really sure why, but I think a request from the viewers of TV stations to the program directors and the reporters that specialize in state house reporting or laws or politics or law enforcement or crime and courts would be important to contact too, to bring some emphasis as well.
Well, it's not like it's not on television. And you're right when you say that legacy media doesn't really cover the topic of strangulation. Now, they certainly cover the stories, and they have no choice but to do that. But they really do seem to avoid the topic of strangulation. I think it is harsh. I think it is traumatizing. I think it's triggering. And maybe they just don't know how to take it on. But putting some of this content out here, and certainly people commenting on those stories and calling it what it is, and making those legacy outlets aware that they're seeing these stories and interacting with them, I think that'll make a big difference. Certainly, I certainly hope that we do start to see, because I've heard already in the news, in the last couple of weeks in South Carolina, um, other bills that are coming out,
Mm-hmm.
and they've got some press heat behind them. And I've heard nothing really about this other than print, which sometimes people don't read print. So it just needs to be everywhere. Like I said, they're already reporting on the stories all day, every day. Um, it would be nice to see them get behind this bill, and I think they will. So,
Yeah. Well, it'll happen eventually. I'm not I'm not one to do this work because we're the last state to do it. I don't want to, say, well, we need to do it because 49 other states have done it. I would just say that, well, 49 other states have recognized how dangerous this is. We need to have that same recognition. The silver lining to this, if there is one, is that we have 49 other states to look at who've already instituted some level, and we can pick from the best and come up hopefully with the best. And I think that's what our bill, which by the way, it's House Bill 3522. If anyone's interested,
thank
that's
you.
House Bill 3522. We're hoping for a companion bill in the Senate, hopefully. Because if we can get a companion bill in the Senate, that means that we have advocates on both sides of our General Assembly who can hopefully meet in the middle and get this, to the governor's desk. But yeah, so we're cautiously optimistic, but very hopeful, and it's going to happen eventually. It's just when is the question, not if.
We're going to put some tools together to help you get this out there as well. And certainly, if anybody is interested in tracking this bill, you can go to scstatehouse.gov and you can add this and track it as it goes through our House. And yeah, I hope to see a companion bill on the Senate side here soon. I'm definitely going to have you back. I can't wait to talk about more of this. Also, we know that you also specialize in elder abuse law. That's another topic that I'm interested. I mean, I never want you to go away. You're a great resource for us, and I just appreciate knowing you. And thank you for spending this time with us tonight to do this. And we'll see you back here very soon, Brian. Thank you.
Absolutely. That strangulation for law for SE. If people go into the documents section, they can download my CV and my bio and many type of informative documents and reports that have been created that they can print and share with anyone.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll make sure we have all that pointed in this as well so people can get to it easily. Check in the description of this for all those links. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
If you enjoy our content and want to stay updated with the latest crime stories and exclusive insights, visit crimedesk.live. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to be notified as stories unfold.